Pedro Plata, a man whose face, sculpted by the sun and the wrinkles of effort, told the story of a simple life, was raising the cement walls of a future he would never see. A bricklayer by trade, he spent his days under the suffocating heat of Mexico City, mixing mortar and laying bricks with an almost artistic precision. His body was a map of calluses and scars, honorable marks of an honest job that supported his greatest joy, his daughter, Sofia. Pedro's life was a cycle of sweat and dedication, a routine of daily sacrifices he accepted gladly. He didn't dream of wealth, but of the peace and security of his small family. As the morning light poured over the chaotic metropolis, Pedro felt the energy of his labor, the weight of the concrete mixer, and the firmness of the brick in his hands. If you're enjoying the story so far, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. This helps me a lot to keep sharing stories like this. The humility of his profession was reflected in his heart, a sanctuary of kindness and righteousness in a world increasingly inclined toward violence. Pedro was the pillar of his home, the safe harbor for Sofia, who saw in her father not just a provider, but a flesh-and-blood hero. The relationship between Pedro and Sofia was the backbone of his existence. She, at just 16 years old, was the light that illuminated the dark and dusty life of the bricklayer. Sofia was a promise, a hope that life could be more than just hard work. She studied, dreamed of being an artist, and her drawings and paintings, full of vivid colors and light strokes, were the perfect contrast to the monotonous gray of her father's life. Pedro spent hours looking at her drawings, seeing in them the pure soul and the bright future he wanted for his daughter. Every brick he laid was a step toward that future. The construction site was his kingdom, a space of transformation where raw matter became something functional and beautiful. There, between bags of cement and twisted rebar, Pedro found a purpose that transcended mere sustenance. He didn't just build walls, he built the dignity of a man who refuses to be defeated by adversity. His colleagues respected him for his honesty and his silent strength. He was the example, the role model to be followed, the kind of man that Mexican society desperately needs, but who is often ignored in their daily struggle. The city around him was a monster of concrete and metal, a jungle of skyscrapers and slums, where the line between right and wrong was more a rough sketch than a clear border. For Pedro, the city was an environment he dominated through his work. He knew every street, every alley, and every shortcut in the peripheral neighborhoods, knowledge acquired through years of walking from home to the worksite. His life was a predictable dance, a series of events that rarely went off script. He felt safe, protected by his own insignificance, believing that the evil of the metropolis would never reach him, as he had nothing that could be coveted or stolen. At home, life was simple, but full of love and small joys. The smell of homemade food, Sofia's laughter, the sound of her music filled the humble rooms. Pedro kept a worn photograph of his daughter in his wallet, a constant reminder of what he was fighting to protect. Sofia's smiling image was his lighthouse, his reason for being, the motivation behind every drop of sweat and every muscle ache he felt at the end of the day. This image was a sanctuary of hope, a certainty that despite the harshness of life, there was beauty and love. Pedro's world was small, but complete. He didn't need luxury, power, or fame. His wealth was in the integrity of his character and the purity of his soul. He was a bricklayer, and he was the best at what he did, because with every movement he put not only the strength of his arms, but the love of his heart. The internal conflict, the fragility of his peaceful existence was still a distant whisper, a shadow hiding in the cracks of the cement, waiting for the right moment to emerge and shatter his life into 1,000 pieces. Pedro's fate, however, was already sealed. The innocence of his life was about to collide with the brutality of the world he had ignored. The joy, love, and peace he so cherished would be ripped from his life in an instant, without warning, and the pain that would follow would not just be the pain of loss, but the pain of betrayal, the disappointment of a system that was supposed to protect the innocent. Pedro's journey was about to begin, a journey that would take him beyond the limits of the morality and humanity he so valued. Pedro's life changed in an instant, a violent blur that tore the fabric of his reality. It was an afternoon like any other, the sun setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Sophia was on her way home from school, backpack on her back and headphones on. She didn't even notice the beat-up black car that stopped next to her in the narrow, dirty alley. Brutal men, with their faces covered, dragged her into the vehicle without a single word. Her scream was trapped in her throat, muffled by the sound of the engine and the brutality of the act. Sophia's backpack fell to the ground, and her books and notebooks scattered across the pavement, a trail of despair that no one noticed. Pedro, upon arriving home and not finding his daughter, was consumed by a chilling panic. He didn't wait, he didn't hesitate. He ran through the streets he knew so well, shouting Sophia's name, his voice hoarse with desperation. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, a pounding of anguish. He went to the police, where he was met with the indifference that had become the norm in the city. A dirty counter, scattered papers, and a policeman with a bored look. Pedro begged, showed his daughter's photo, described the car, but was met with a cold contempt, as if his pain were an inconvenience. The justice he so respected was simply not interested in his daughter, one more life in a sea of tragedies. Pedro's desperation turned to fury. He went to the police station begging for help, but the response was a slap in the face. "Come back tomorrow, sir. Missing persons cases are common around here." Detective Miguel, a tired man with eyes that had seen too much, watched him from a distance, showing no emotion. To him, Pedro was just another desperate father, and Sophia another statistic. The inertia of the system was a silent poison that corroded the soul. Pedro felt the overwhelming helplessness of a common man against a corrupt and uninterested power. Pedro's search for Sophia ended in a scene that would haunt him forever. It was a neighbor who tipped him off about a body found in a vacant lot, a place he had passed hundreds of times. When he approached, the air grew heavy with the smell of death. There, lying on a pile of rubble, with her innocence stolen and her life crushed, was his Sophia. The vibrant colors of her drawings seemed to have drained from her body, leaving only the gray of mourning. Pedro fell to his knees beside his daughter's body, the overwhelming pain and the cry of his heart reverberating in the silence of the place. It was in that moment, with his daughter's lifeless body in his arms and the indifference of the police still echoing in his ears, that something broke inside Pedro. The bricklayer who built homes was now faced with the destruction of his own world. Helplessness turned into a raging fire, and sadness into a relentless fury. He lifted his head and looked at the city, at the monster that had taken everything from him, and made a decision. If justice wouldn't come from above, he would make it from below. He stood up, but he was no longer Pedro, the bricklayer. He was something new, forged in pain, a vigilante driven by vengeance. If the law doesn't protect the innocent, then the law is useless. He whispered into the air, a solemn promise that would seal his fate. From that moment on, vengeance was his only law. Pedro's life, once a monument to honest labor, crumbled into a pile of emotional rubble. The first few weeks after Sophia's death were a silent hell, a fog of pain and grief that paralyzed him. He wandered the streets, no longer the proud bricklayer, but a ghost, with his eyes fixed on a void that only he saw. The rage, however, began to simmer beneath the surface, fueled by the police's inaction and the memories of his daughter. That fire, initially a timid ember, became a furnace, consuming his sadness and leaving behind only an insatiable thirst for revenge, a driving force that would shape a new man. Pedro's journey began not with violence, but with observation. He went back to being the bricklayer, but with a different purpose. He used his knowledge of the streets and the people to listen. He spent hours in corner bars and markets, catching fragments of conversations, whispers about the cartel and the names of its members. His mind, once focused on construction angles and measurements, now mapped the city's criminal network. He was the invisible one, the man no one noticed, the bricklayer who blended into the urban landscape, silently building his plan for revenge. The bricklayer who built walls was now dismantling lives. He modified his work tools, transforming them into weapons for his new trade. The hammer, once used to drive nails, was now an extension of his fury. The metal chisel, sharpened to a point, would become a silent dagger. The plumb bob, which once ensured the alignment of walls, was now a weight for striking in the darkness. Each of his tools, once symbols of creation, was desecrated into symbols of destruction. He became an artisan of death, using his manual skill with a terrifying precision, a dark knowledge of the human body and its weak points. The first vengeance was brutal and disorganized, an explosion of rage. More than a planned act, he found one of the men responsible in a filthy bar. Rage took over. The scene was a massacre. Pedro used the weight of his bricklayer's hammer, the familiar tool in his hands becoming an instrument of brutal justice. The man, caught by surprise, had no chance. Pedro felt no joy, only a dark satisfaction and a deep nausea. He had crossed the line, and the bloodstain on his hands was a reminder that there was no turning back. The path to vengeance brought no peace, only an even greater emptiness. Every life he took, every act of violence, stole a piece of his own soul. At night, he was haunted by nightmares of Sophia, who looked at him with those innocent eyes. Her face was everywhere, in every brick he passed, in every reflection in the window. He tried to fill this void with the next act of vengeance, but discovered that cruelty was a bottomless pit. The pain of his grief mingled with the guilt of his actions, transforming him into a creature of pain and suffering. The brutal deaths began to attract attention. The small cartel, led by El Rato, grew furious at the audacity of a ghost who was hunting their men. El Rato, a sadistic and unpredictable criminal, couldn't understand who could be so daring as to challenge him. Paranoia began to spread among his men, who now walked in groups and looked over their shoulders. Pedro was not a common threat. He was a force of nature, silent, methodical, and unstoppable. Meanwhile, Detective Miguel, who had previously ignored Pedro, was now in charge of the case. The bodies found, the brutality, and the lack of clues intrigued him. He saw a pattern in the deaths, a violence that seemed personal. The crimes were not random. They were acts of vengeance. Miguel, a man tired of the corrupt system, began to feel intrigued by the Vigilante, almost admiring his audacity in a world where justice was a luxury. He began to connect the dots, remembering the desperate bricklayer who had entered his police station. Pedro's hunt became more complex. He was no longer just hunting the men, he was also avoiding the police. The cat-and-mouse game intensified, with Pedro moving in the shadows, using his knowledge of the city to disappear into thin air. The construction sites became his sanctuaries, his observation posts and his traps. He spent hours on top of buildings under construction, observing the movements of the criminals and the police, planning his next steps with the patience of an artisan. He was the shadow, the noise that the cartel and the police couldn't explain. Pedro became more than a killer, he became a myth. The criminals began to call the Vigilante the cement ghost, a demon who used the silence of the night and the tools of the day to hunt them down. This reputation preceded him, terrifying his targets. With each death, he became colder and more calculated. The rage that once drove him transformed into a chilling calm, the serenity of a man who has already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. He no longer felt pain or guilt. He was just a machine of vengeance. The noose was tightening. Pedro was now on the trail of El Rato, the cartel leader, the man who ordered his daughter's death. He had information that El Rato used a hidden mansion on the city's outskirts as his headquarters. Pedro knew that attacking the mansion would be a suicidal act, but he no longer cared about his own life. His only concern was revenge. The bricklayer, who once used bricks to build, now used them to destroy. He was ready for the final confrontation. His journey, which began with the innocence of a father, had transformed into a descent into hell. He had to make choices he never thought he would. But there was no choice. There was only one path. He was a man on a mission, a man who could not fail. With each step, he left behind what remained of his humanity. His conscience, once a mirror of goodness, was now a lake of mud and blood. He knew that, at the end of his journey, he would become an exact reflection of the evil he had sworn to destroy. Pedro, in his solitude, spent hours looking at Sofia's photo, the only thing that still connected him to his previous life. He wondered if she would be proud of the man he had become. The answer was clear in his mind. She would be terrified. Her memory was his cross and his strength, the weight of guilt and the spark of his motivation. Sofia's smiling face was the ghost that haunted him, the reminder of his failure to protect her. He lived and killed for her, but with each life he took, he lost her a little more, moving further away from the man she once loved. Detective Miguel, in turn, was getting closer. He had seen Sofia's photo on the police station counter and, over time, connected the girl's disappearance and death to the murders. He knew the vigilante was the bricklayer, Pedro Plata. Miguel felt a strange sympathy for the man, understanding his pain, but knew he couldn't let him continue. He was a man of the law, and no matter how much he sympathized with the cause, the method was anarchy. Miguel knew that Pedro's search would end in one of two ways: death or prison. Pedro, however, was focused. He knew the final confrontation was near. He spent nights observing El Rato's mansion, studying the security, the guards' routines, the weak points of the structure. He noticed that the mansion was in an isolated area, surrounded by forest and a stream, which made an approach difficult. But Pedro was not a man of frontal attacks. He was a bricklayer. A knowledge of structures and terrain was his greatest weapon. He planned an attack that would use the environment against his enemies. He would use cement, rebar, and stone as his accomplices. The tension between Pedro and Miguel was palpable, even without a direct confrontation. They were two sides of the same coin, the failure of justice. Miguel represented the law that didn't work, and Pedro the violence that filled that void. Each of them moved on their own path, one in search of order and the other in search of vengeance. Their fates were intertwined, and the final confrontation would be the climax of this moral and legal battle. The crime scene in which both lived and breathed was the same, but their worldviews were completely opposite. The local press began to call the vigilante the cement ghost, due to his victims being found at construction sites or with bricklayers' tools. El Rato, furious with the press and the police pressure, promised he would find the person responsible. The hunt became mutual, with the cartel using all its resources to find the vigilante. Pedro knew that time was running out. It was now or never. The pain and rage crystallized into a cold determination. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He was vengeance itself. Pedro's journey was almost at its end. El Rato's mansion was his destination, his final point. He had spent weeks studying the mansion's routine and security, noticing a flaw he could exploit. There was a drainage tunnel that ran under the mansion, connected to a nearby stream. It was small, dirty, but it was his path. The smell of sewage didn't bother him. He had already reached rock bottom. He prepared for the confrontation, using his experience with confined spaces to create an escape route. El Rato's cartel members were scared, and the pressure from above began to affect the group. They didn't know who was hunting them, and the legend of the cement ghost grew. El Rato, a man of pure cruelty, decided he would make an example of the next man Pedro killed. Violence would be the answer to violence. Pedro sensed the change in the group's behavior, which made him accelerate his plans. There was no more time for subtleties. It was time to confront evil face to face. He wasn't just avenging his daughter's death, he was fighting for his own soul. The violence Pedro had embraced was a poison, and he knew it. He could feel his heart hardening with each act, his mind getting used to the cruelty. He remembered the first time he wielded his hammer to kill, the revulsion he felt. Now it was second nature. He no longer felt the nausea, just the satisfaction of completing his mission. Empathy became a luxury he could no longer afford. His humanity was being traded for an act of vengeance, a soul for a soul. He wondered if this was the only way to get justice in such a cruel world. Detective Miguel, in a risky move, decided to go after the bricklayer. He had his location, an abandoned construction site on the outskirts. He knew Pedro would be there, preparing for his final attack. Miguel was in a moral dilemma. He wanted to stop Pedro, but he also wanted to see him have his revenge. He represented the system that failed Pedro, and now he was the only thing preventing him from having his justice. Miguel knew that the confrontation between them would be inevitable, but he wanted a chance to talk to the man before violence separated them forever. The pressure mounted. The cartel, in an act of desperation, began hunting the cement ghost in his own home. They broke into Pedro's house looking for him, but he was no longer there. They took their revenge by destroying what was left of his life, breaking the few objects Pedro still had of his daughter. This action was the final nail in the coffin of Pedro's sanity. The rage that was once calculated was now pure fury. There was nothing left to lose. The hunt was over. Pedro was ready for the final battle. He had everything he needed, his tools, his rage, and his solitude. He hid in the shadows of the construction site, waiting for the right moment to attack. He felt no fear, just an emptiness that vengeance seemed to be the only thing capable of filling. He knew he wouldn't get out alive, but that no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was that El Rato paid for what he did. His life was the currency, his soul the price. The final battle was about to begin, the climax of a story of pain and vengeance. The scene was set. The construction site, Pedro's home, was now the stage for his personal tragedy. Detective Miguel was arriving, but he knew it would probably be too late. The only thing left was to see the end of the story. Pedro, the bricklayer who became the cruelest vigilante, was about to achieve his revenge, but he would become a prisoner of his own rage. The path to justice was paved with blood and tears, and Pedro didn't care about the price as long as El Rato also paid. The rain washed the blood from the construction site, but not from Pedro's soul. Detective Miguel approached, not with the fury of the law, but with the sadness of a man who understands pain. He didn't need to use force. Pedro turned, extended his arms, and allowed Miguel to handcuff him. There was no resistance, no defiance. The fury that consumed him had disappeared, replaced by a terrifying emptiness, a silence that screamed the defeat of his humanity. El Rato's body lay in a pit, and Pedro, with the handcuffs on his wrists, became one more prisoner of the failed justice system that had once turned its back on him. The end of his journey of vengeance was the beginning of his eternal prison, not just behind bars, but within himself. The bricklayer who built a life in its simplicity was now locked in a concrete cell, a bitter reflection of his own trade. The sounds of the construction site, the noise of the concrete mixer, and the chatter of his colleagues were replaced by the oppressive silence of the cell. The life he had built for his daughter, the hope, had disappeared. The revenge he sought with such fury didn't bring his daughter back, didn't fill the hole in his heart, and only served to trap the man he was. Pedro now was just a number, one more statistic of a system that failed to protect him and was now punishing him for his own justice. In his cell, Pedro spent his days looking at his reflection in a puddle of dirty water on the floor. He saw the face of a stranger, a monster he had created himself. He touched his hands, which were once calloused from honest work, and were now stained with a blood that would never be washed away. Pedro's vengeance came with a price, and the currency was his own soul. He wondered if his daughter would forgive him for the man he had become. He knew the answer was no. His Sophia's purity would never be able to understand the darkness that consumed him. The vengeance was for him, a desperate attempt to restore something that was broken, but it only served to break him even more. Pedro sat on his mattress, the photo of Sophia in his hands. He caressed the worn image with his thumb, feeling a deep pain. He knew his story would be told, that he would be seen as a monster or a hero, but he was neither. He was just a broken man, a victim who became a predator. He looked at his daughter's photo and whispered, "This story, it cost everything, but it needed to be told. We need a world where justice doesn't fail so that no one else has to do what I did." If you care about stories like mine that make you think and feel, please subscribe so we can continue sharing narratives that remind us of the importance of empathy. The end of Pedro's story was not a happy ending. It was a reflection on the failure of society. He had punished evil, but had become his own version of it. The city, the concrete monster that had broken him, now held him captive in a cell. Pedro looked out the window and saw the sunrise, the same light that once illuminated his daughter's life, but now it was just a reminder of the darkness that consumed him. Pedro's vengeance was over, but the cycle of violence and pain continued. His story was a cry of warning, a reminder that justice, when abandoned, can breed monsters. And in the end, all that was left was the memory of his daughter and the eternal solitude he had bought with blood.